The 1995 Seattle Mariners is arguably one of the most exciting teams in this franchise's history, and a lot has been made comparing the 2022 Mariners to those 95 Mariners. So, as any normal person would do, let's go through and compare it ourselves. The 1995 Mariners went 79-66. Now keep in mind there was only 145 games in a season back then, so this put them on pace to win right around 88 games, whereas the 2022 Mariners won 90. The 1995 Mariners finished first in the AL West, and who can forget when they were down 12.5 games behind the California Angels and made an insane comeback to win the division. Sounds kind of similar to when the Mariners were 10.5 games back from making the wild card, and then they made an insane comeback, including winning 14 games in a row to eventually make the wild card. Obviously, baseball is a much different game now than it was back then. The 1995 Seattle Mariners were managed by Lou Piniella, before this year the only manager in Mariners history to make it to the playoffs. And then of course, we can only compare Lou to our boy, Scott Servais, the second Mariners manager to ever make it to the playoffs. You can see here that Lou Piniella spent 10 years in a Mariners uniform from 1993 to 2002, winning 840 games. So far, Servais has spent 7 years from 2016 to 2022, winning 528 games.
We need to add another one.
Scott is also the only other Mariners manager in history to have over a 500 winning percentage, and again is the second manager to ever make it to the playoffs with the Mariners.
Let's party!
Now, as we look at the Mariners roster for 2022, we're not going to go over every single player because that would just take an eternity, but we are going to note some very important players that have really good matchups with the 95 team. Now, we're not going to start with some of the obvious ones here. We'll save those to the end because there's actually more in common with the 95 team than I originally thought. The first player that we're going to start with is John Paul Crawford, JP. JP hit 243, 339, 336 with an exactly 100 OPS plus. Now, JP, in my opinion, compares best with Luis Sojo. In 1995, Luis Sojo had a 289, 335, 416 slash line with a 94 OPS plus. But I think the thing that really stands out amongst Sojo and against JP is this right here, and that is their strikeout to walk ratio. Sojo walked 23 times and struck out 19. He walked more than he had struck out. If we go over to JP here and we go down to 2022, we could see not quite the same. JP struck out 80 times and walked 68 times. Again, different era of baseball, a lot more strikeouts in baseball nowadays. JP had 3 stolen bases, whereas Luis Sojo had 4. Conveniently, both JP and Sojo played shortstop for the Mariners teams that made the playoffs, so I think it's a pretty easy comparison. Now, this comparison, maybe not as easy. We're going to go ahead and take Adam Frazier here. Now, Frazier hit 238, 301, 311 with an 80 OPS plus. We're going to take Frazier and compare him to little Joey Cora. Cora hit 297, 359, 372 with a 91 OPS plus. Honestly, shocking to see OPS plus being at a 91 when Cora hit 297, 359, 372. But Cora's ability to slap hits the other way and just take the ball where it's pitched while not having a whole lot of power, I think puts him right up there in Adam Frazier territory. Cora hit 3 home runs with 39 RBIs, and Frazier hit himself 3 home runs with 42 RBI. I would definitely take Cora over Frazier, but I think that their bat to ball skills really makes these two very, very comparable. Now we have Mariners hero Big Dumper Cal Raleigh that we're looking at here. And
Hey, it's Big Dumper. Let's go get the next series. Let's go, baby.
And don't let the slash line fool you. Cal Raleigh has been a much better player than his slash line suggests. And we're going to compare Cal Raleigh to Tino Martinez, one of the best first basemen in Mariners history. Obviously, Raleigh plays a much more premium position at catcher, but alas, his swing compared to Tino's is very similar. We have the left-handed power, and looking at Cal's season, he hit 211, 284, 489 with a 122 OPS plus, 27 home runs, and 63 RBI. Scrolling over here to Tino hit 293, 369, 551 with a 135 OPS plus, 31 home runs, and 111 RBI. Obviously, it's not a perfect comparison. Tino was not a switch hitter, whereas of course Cal is. Tino was, in my opinion, a much better hitter than Cal, but Cal has come up really big in some really big moments, and I think that with his left-handed swing, comparing it to Tino's, I think they have a really good comparison. I'm going to give you a chance on this one to take a guess who we're comparing Eric Swanson to. Let me read off Eric Swanson's stats, and then we'll go from there. Eric Swanson played in 57 games. He had a 185 whip. He had a 222 ERA plus with a 168 ERA. He struck out 70 batters. He had an 11.7 strikeouts per 9 and a 7 strikeout to walk. In your opinion, who do you think Swanson compares to? I'll give you 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That is right. If you guessed Norm Charlton, then you are correct. Norm Charlton had a 151 ERA. He pitched in 47 2/3 innings. He ended up striking out 58 batters. He had a 2.28 FIP, and he had an ERA plus of 318. He also did boast a 11 strikeout per 9 ratio, which is lower than Swanson's, and a 3.63 strikeout per walk, which is again lower than Swanson. When I was looking at Norm Charlton originally, I was like, that's Andres Munoz. That's gotta be Andres Munoz, but I think that Swanson just matches up with him so much better. Now, we know how valuable Norm Charlton was to the 1995 Seattle Mariners, and Eric Swanson, I feel like, is the unsung hero of this team. When you have pitchers like Andres Munoz and Paul Sewald that have been so good, Swanson has been probably the best pitcher in the Mariners bullpen. And speaking of Andres Munoz, let's take a look at him. He had a 149 ERA plus with a 249 ERA. He had a 13.3 strikeouts per 9 with a 6.4 strikeouts per walk ratio. And Munoz was really good, striking out 96 hitters in 65 innings. I think the best comparison for Andres Munoz is Jeff Nelson. Now, Jeff Nelson had a 220 ERA plus, a 217 ERA. He also struck out 96 batters, same as Munoz, but he did it in 78 innings. So his strikeout per 9 was down to 11 instead of the 13.3 that Munoz had, and he had a 3.56 strikeouts to walk. Of course, Munoz is the fire breather out in the bullpen for the Seattle Mariners, but, you know, I think that he compares a little bit better to Jeff Nelson than he does Norm Charlton. Now, we're going to go ahead and finish out our pitchers here, and we're going to be looking at, you would assume, Luis Castillo to compare to Randy Johnson, right? But no, instead we are going to compare George Kirby to Randy Johnson, simply because Kirby closed out the final game of the wild card round. Who could forget when Randy closed out games in the 1995 postseason, and Kirby coming in, it just felt so similar. And Kirby has definitely been one of the best pitchers in all of baseball this year, not just for the Mariners, all of baseball. His strikeouts per 9 is 9.2. His strikeouts to walks is 6.05. Kirby had a 109 OPS plus with a 339 ERA. Kirby struck out 133 batters to just 22 walks. And it's nearly impossible to compare somebody to Randy Johnson. Randy had a 2.48 ERA in 95 with a 193 ERA plus. He had 12.3 strikeouts per 9 with a 4.52 strikeout to walk ratio. Randy, of course, won the Cy Young that year, and it's just so hard to compare somebody in the 2022 season to Randy Johnson, who struck out 294 batters in an era where hitters just didn't strike out as much. But it's simply the closing out of the wildcard series that makes Kirby so much like Randy Johnson to me. I was getting flashbacks the whole time. Now we have 4 players left on our list that I want to make comparisons to, and I think that you can probably guess who some of them are. But right now we're going to look at one of the best players on the Seattle Mariners in 2022, Eugenio Suarez. Gino hit 236, 332, 459 with a 129 OPS plus. He slugged 31 home runs with 87 RBI. And keep in mind, Gino still played in 150 games. Gino is one of the most consistent players there are on the team. He did, however, set the franchise record for the most strikeouts in a single season with 196. And in 1995, the player that struck out the most was Mike Blowers with 128, but he was still so incredibly valuable to that team. At third base, also 30 years old, same age as Gino, and I just feel like these players are so similar. Blowers hit 23 home runs with 96 RBIs. He hit 257, 335, 474 with a 108 OPS plus. Gino, I think, is definitely the better defensive player, but Mike Blowers, of course, we hear him on the radio and on the broadcast all the time. Mike Blowers is definitely one of the greatest players in Mariners history, and I think Gino is on that same track. Gino definitely has more power than Blowers ever had. However, Blowers in 1995 set his career high with 23 home runs. Blowers did only play in 134 games that year, but again, that's only 11 games short of a full season, whereas Gino was about 12 games short, so roughly about the same kind of time frame. Comparing Mitch Haniger to anybody on the 95 team is super difficult because Mitch's injuries definitely led to some interesting numbers for Haniger in the outfield this year. He hit 246, 308, 429 with a 114 OPS plus. He slugged 11 home runs and 34 RBI. And I think the best comparison, at least for Mitch and how valuable Mitch is to the lineup, is gotta be the right fielder in 1995, Jay Buhner. Now, Jay Buhner was incredible in 95, hitting 40 home runs, 121 RBI. He had a 262, 343, 566 slash line with a 131 OPS plus. Don't get me wrong, Buhner was definitely the better player that year, but this is relatively similar to Mitch's 2021, where Mitch hit 253, 318, 485 with a 122 OPS plus, hitting 39 home runs and 100 RBI compared to Buhner's 40 home runs and 121 RBI. Of course, both of them playing right field for the Seattle Mariners in a year that they make the playoffs. Buhner and Haniger really do seem like very similar players, always going to hit in the middle of your lineup, have a chance to extend the lead if one swing of the bat, and I think that this is the best possible comparison that we could get for Mitch Haniger. There are, of course, two players left that we want to take a look at, and I think you can assume who both these players are. We're going to start off with Vive la France, Ty France. Ty France this year in 140 games hit 276, 340, 437 with a 126 OPS plus, 20 home runs, and 84 RBI. France's steady approach in the batter's box led the Mariners to a lot of wins, and France's ability to make contact when in the biggest moments of the year really mattered. That reminds me of somebody by the name of Edgar Martinez.
On the way to Edgar Martinez, swung on the line down the left field line for a base hit. Here comes Joy. Here is Junior to third base. They're gonna wave him in.
Now, Edgar is, of course, a Hall of Famer, but if you had to compare the two, we're looking at a 356, 479, 628 year for Edgar with a 185 OPS plus. Edgar did end up hitting 29 home runs with 113 RBIs, and of course, it's impossible to compare somebody to Edgar Martinez, but I think Ty France is probably the best player that we could use, as they both made the All-Star game, and there's one picture that I can think of from that year and this year that just bring these last two players so much closer together. Ty France came over to the Mariners as a man without a position, very similarly to how Edgar Martinez had to make the transition to DH after he hurt his knee at third base. Originally a third baseman, Ty France eventually moved over to first base, and France has really made a name for himself at first base and one of the best defensive players there are at the position. With Evan White going down, and who knows what the heck's going to happen with Evan White, Ty France has been the perfect fill-in as the franchise first baseman, and I think that another franchise player compares to one of the best of all time. Here's the picture from the 95 season. Tell me, what does this picture remind you of? In my opinion, it reminds me of this picture. And of course, we're going to be talking about stud center fielder Julio Rodriguez. Now, if we're just comparing numbers here, we already know who we're going to compare Julio to, right? Julio hit 284, 345, 509 with a 147 OPS plus. He hit 28 home runs with 75 RBI and 25 stolen bases. Now, we've heard the comparison made time and time again to Ken Griffey Jr., and that's exactly who we're comparing him to today, where Griffey hit 258, 379, 481 with a 122 OPS plus. Griffey slugged 17 home runs with 42 RBIs. Griffey did, however, only play in 72 games. If you remember, this was the year that Griffey ran into the fence and broke his wrist. And losing Griffey was very hard on the team, where they had to try to stay afloat around 500. They were thinking to themselves, just wait till we get Griffey back in the middle of August. He had a wrist injury throughout the middle of the summer, and so did Julio after he came back from the Home Run Derby and the All-Star game. He too had a wrist injury that kept him out for about a week. Obviously, the Mariners didn't lose Julio for nearly as long as they did when they lost Griffey in that pennant chase, but alas, the similarities are shocking. Of course, Julio also did have his back injury, which did not help him out one bit. And I think that Julio in 2022 was a better player overall than Griffey was. Maybe it's just because he had more games, but alas, Julio was so damn good this year, it's impossible to look any different. With the Mariners, who had been down 12.5 games to the California Angels, they made a comeback and made the playoffs. Just like how the Mariners this year were 10 games back of a wild card spot and they looked dead in the water. And what they do, they came charging back and they once again made the playoffs for the first time in 20 years. Now, my question to you is, which team do you think would win? If we put the 2022 Mariners up against the 1995 Seattle Mariners, who would win that game? Let's call it a best of 3, a wild card series between the two. I'm not gonna lie, I think that I'm taking the 2022 Mariners. I think that their pitching staff is so much better, minus of course Randy Johnson, than the 95 team. The Mariners in 2022 I feel like are a much more complete team than the 95 team. Does that mean anything? In my opinion, no. Baseball is such a fickle mistress that you could win 116 games in a year and get knocked out early. And I think this is where the comparisons need to stop, because I think the 2022 Mariners are their own team. I don't think we need to compare them to what is called the greatest team in the history of this franchise, because this season isn't even over yet. The Seattle Mariners in 2022 still have a bit of a story to tell, and I think that this team deserves their own place in Mariners history, separate from the 95 and the 2001 team. And I think that the 2022 Mariners, after they went into Toronto and did what they did, they deserve their own special spot in our heart. And if we want to talk a little bit more about the history the Mariners made in the playoffs, well, we did it right here in this video. Check that out. I appreciate you guys watching this one, and go Mariners.